At my 60th birthday party, in a private room at the country club I had belonged to for 26 years, surrounded by 40 of our closest friends, my wife of 33 years stood up, tapped her fork against her wine glass until the whole room went quiet, and announced that our marriage was over. She said it smiling. I want you to sit with that detail for a moment, because I have sat with it every single day since. She was smiling when she ended 33 years of my life in front of everyone I loved. Before I tell you what happened after that, thank you for being here with me tonight. If this story means something to you, I would love to know where you are watching from. And if stories like mine matter to you, please consider subscribing so you do not miss what comes next. A quick note before we begin. Some names and details in this story have been changed to protect the people involved, but what happened, and what it cost me, is real. She raised her glass first before any of it, the way you raise a glass for a toast, and 40 people raised theirs back instinctively, smiling, waiting for something warm about 3 decades of marriage. What they got instead was Diane telling a room full of my closest friends and both of our grown sons that she had found someone who actually made her feel alive again, someone named Derek, and that she hoped I would understand, eventually, that some people simply grow apart after enough years. My name is Gerald Whitfield. Most people call me Jerry. I am 60 years old, and for 33 of those years I ran a small accounting firm in Charlotte, North Carolina. The kind of practice built one loyal client at a time, where you learn a family's entire financial history over decades, their college funds and their mortgage refinances and their retirement accounts, and where you learn, alongside all of that, something about the quiet architecture of how people actually build a life together, dollar by careful dollar, decision by careful decision. I sold the firm 4 years ago to a younger partner I had trained myself, planning to spend my 60s exactly the way Diane, and I had always talked about spending them, traveling, spoiling our eventual grandchildren, growing old together in the house we had raised our sons in. I want you to understand something about my profession before I tell you the rest of this story, because it matters more than almost anything else in it. 33 years of forensic bookkeeping teaches you to notice discrepancies before you fully understand what they mean. A number that does not quite reconcile, a pattern of withdrawals that does not match a family's stated spending habits, a story about where money went that technically adds up but somehow still does not feel entirely true. You learn to trust that feeling of almost, the sense that something is nearly right but not quite, long before you can articulate exactly what is. I had been feeling that particular sense of almost about my own marriage for the better part of 18 months before that birthday party. I had simply refused, for reasons I understand better now than I did then, to let myself follow that feeling all the way to its actual conclusion. Diane and I met in 1991, both of us 26 years old, at a mutual friend's wedding in Asheville. She was working as an elementary school teacher then, bright and quick-witted in a way that made an entire reception table lean in whenever she started telling a story, and I was 2 years into building my accounting practice, still working out of a converted garage because I could not yet afford real office space. We were married 18 months later, in a small ceremony at the same church her parents had married in decades earlier, and I remember standing at that altar thinking, with the specific, total certainty you only really feel once or twice in an entire lifetime, that I had found exactly the right person to build everything else around. I want to tell you a few specific memories from those early decades, not because they matter individually, but because I think the accumulated weight of them explains something about why the eventual betrayal cut as deeply as it did. I remember Diane sitting up with me until 2 in the morning during the first tax season after our wedding, helping me organize receipts into categories on our kitchen table, because the practice was still too small to afford any staff, both of us laughing at how absurd it was that a working accountant could be that disorganized inside his own young business. I remember her holding Kevin as a newborn, 3 days old, standing at our nursery window at 4 in the morning, singing something quietly off-key, because neither of us actually knew any lullabies, and looking up at me with an expression of such complete, unguarded happiness that I have never forgotten it even now, even after everything. I remember the year my own father died, when Diane took over managing an entire funeral's worth of logistics without being asked, understanding, in the specific way only a genuinely loving partner understands, that I needed to simply grieve rather than organize, and handling every phone call, every awkward extended family conversation, every detail of an event neither of us had wanted to plan, so that I could have the space to actually feel what I was feeling. I remember our 25th anniversary, a trip to Italy we had saved toward for 3 full years, standing on a balcony in Florence watching the sun set over the Arno River, Diane's hand in mine, both of us quietly amazed that 25 years had somehow moved that quickly. Our first son, Kevin, arrived a year into the marriage, followed by Tyler 5 years after that, and the next quarter century unfolded the way most marriages unfold, not in dramatic peaks and valleys, but in the accumulated weight of thousands of small, ordinary days, little league games and school plays, and Diane eventually working her way up to assistant principal at the elementary school 2 towns over. My own practice growing slowly and steadily until it could comfortably support the life we had built together. We were not a perfect marriage. I do not want to paint us as something we were not. We argued about money sometimes, about how much time I spent at the office during tax season, about whose turn it was to deal with whichever crisis our teenage sons had most recently generated. But underneath all of that, for 30 years, I never once seriously doubted that we were building something real together, something meant to last considerably longer than either of us individually would. I want to pause the story here for a moment, because I think you deserve to form your own theory before I tell you the rest. A wife who stands up at her husband's 60th birthday party in front of 40 guests and announces her marriage is over with a smile on her face, naming the other man directly in the same breath. What kind of relationship, what kind of planning do you think sits underneath a moment engineered to be delivered exactly that publicly, exactly that cruelly? Write your guess in the comments below. I will tell you how close you came by the end of this. I want to walk you through the 18 months before that party honestly, year by year, month by month, because the change in Diane was slow enough that I did not fully recognize its shape while I was living inside it. The way you do not notice a room slowly filling with smoke if you have been sitting in it the entire time yourself. About 2 years ago, roughly a year and a half before the party, Diane joined a boutique fitness studio downtown, a place called Elevate that had opened with considerable fanfare, all exposed brick and moody lighting, and a client roster that skewed, I would eventually learn, heavily toward affluent women in their 50s and 60s, looking for exactly the kind of transformation the studio's marketing promised. She had always taken care of herself, walked most mornings, watched what she ate, but this was different. A new intensity, 4 sessions a week, then 5. A personal trainer she mentioned with increasing frequency at dinner. A man named Derek who apparently had, in Diane's telling, an almost supernatural ability to understand exactly what her body and increasingly her spirit actually needed. I did not think much of it at first. I want to be honest about that. I was, if anything, glad to see her energized, glad to watch her come home from those sessions with color in her cheeks, and a lightness in her step I associated, foolishly, with simple physical exercise rather than anything more complicated developing underneath it. 31 years married by that point, I understood that marriages need their own separate spaces to breathe, hobbies and friendships that exist outside the shared architecture of a household. And I told myself, for longer than I probably should have, that Elevate and Derek were simply Diane's version of that separate space. By about a year before the party, the changes had become harder to explain away so comfortably. Diane started dressing differently, not dramatically, but noticeably. New workout clothes that seemed considerably more curated than the practical athletic, where she had worn for decades. A new hairstyle, a new attention to her phone that had not existed before, checking it during dinner in a way she had always specifically criticized other people for doing. She started using language I did not recognize as hers, phrases about energy and alignment and living authentically that sounded, to my ear, considerably more like Derek's marketing copy than anything Diane herself had ever expressed interest in across 3 decades of marriage. I asked her about it once, carefully, over dinner about 10 months before the party, keeping my tone as light and non-accusatory as I could manage. I asked whether everything was okay, whether the intensity at Elevate was actually about fitness or about something else she wanted to talk about. She laughed, a little too quickly, and told me I was being paranoid, that a woman was allowed to invest in herself without her husband turning it into some kind of interrogation. I let it go. I have thought many times since about how much of what followed might have unfolded differently if I had not let it go quite so easily. The final 6 months before the party brought the clearest signals. The ones I understand now I chose not to fully interpret because interpreting them would have meant confronting something I was not yet ready to confront. Diane started traveling for what she called wellness retreats, weekend trips to Asheville and once, memorably, an entire week in Sedona, always framed around Elevate's broader community, always including, I would eventually learn, Derek himself as either an organizer or a fellow attendee. She began sleeping in the guest room more frequently, blaming my snoring, a complaint that had existed for years without ever previously requiring separate bedrooms. She grew distant with our sons in a way that confused both of them, canceling a planned dinner with Kevin twice in a row, missing one of Tyler's school events entirely for the first time in his adult life. I confronted her more directly about 6 weeks before the party, sitting her down in our living room and asking plainly whether she was having an affair. She denied it forcefully, told me Derek was simply her trainer and a friend, that my suspicion said more about my own insecurity than about anything actually happening between them. And I want to be honest that some part of me, the part that had spent 33 years wanting desperately to trust the woman I had built an entire life around, chose to believe her, or at least chose to stop pressing hard enough to force the issue any further. I did not know, sitting in that living room accepting her denial, that Diane and Derek had already, by that point, been planning the exact shape of that birthday party announcement for weeks. The party itself was Diane's idea, insisted upon with an enthusiasm I mistook, at the time, for genuine excitement about celebrating my milestone birthday. She handled every detail herself, the venue, the guest list, the seating arrangements, telling me repeatedly to simply relax and let her surprise me, a request I honored completely, walking into that private room at the country club with no idea whatsoever that I was walking into the single most humiliating evening of my adult life, 40 guests. Our sons Kevin and Tyler, flown in from Atlanta and driven up from his apartment across town, respectively. My brother. College friends I had known for 4 decades. Neighbors, colleagues from my old practice, members of the church we had attended together for 25 years. Diane had assembled, with what I now understand was considerable deliberate care, the largest possible audience for what she was about to do. And there was one table near the back that I did not fully recognize, 3 or 4 newer faces Diane had waved off, when I glanced over the seating chart that week, as friends from the studio, and I had nodded and moved on because no man audits the guest list of his own birthday party. He should. I am joking. I am also, as you are about to find out, not joking at all. She waited until the main course had been cleared, until the room was warm with wine and conversation, before standing, tapping her glass, and asking for everyone's attention. I remember feeling a swell of genuine affection watching her stand there, assuming, right up until the final few sentences, that I was about to hear a warm, funny toast about 33 years of marriage. Even the professional radar that had been quietly pinging for 18 months went silent in that moment, and I have since made a certain peace with why. Hope, I have learned, is the one auditor who always signs off. Jerry, she said, smiling directly at me, thank you for 33 wonderful years. I mean that truly. But I think it's time we both admit that people change, that we've grown into very different versions of ourselves than the 2 kids who got married in night. I've found someone who sees the person I've actually become. Derek, would you stand up? A man I had never formally met, 38 years old I would later learn, stood up from a table near the back of the room, raising his own glass with an expression that managed to be simultaneously apologetic and smugly triumphant. And I sat there, 60 years old, surrounded by everyone I loved, watching my wife of 33 years toast to the end of our marriage in favor of a personal trainer more than 2 decades her junior, in a room I was paying for, on the night. I do not remember standing up. I am told by my brother Frank, who described it to me later with visible pain in his own voice, that I simply sat very still for almost a full minute, my face, in his words, going through something he had never seen on another human being before I finally stood, said nothing at all, and walked out of that private room into the parking lot, leaving 40 guests, my own sons, and my soon-to-be ex-wife standing in stunned silence. I sat in my car in that parking lot for almost 2 hours before I trusted myself to drive home. I want to tell you about the weeks that followed, because I think the specific texture of that early devastation matters for understanding everything that came after it. I did not sleep more than 3 or 4 hours a night for the better part of a month. I lost 11 pounds without trying, the specific, involuntary weight loss that comes from a body simply refusing food during a crisis, rather than any deliberate choice to diet. I found myself, more than once, standing in our kitchen at 3 in the morning, staring at photographs on the refrigerator, our sons as small boys, a family vacation to the Outer Banks 15 years earlier, trying and failing to reconcile the woman smiling in those photographs with the woman who had smiled, while ending our marriage in front of 40 witnesses. I want to describe one particular morning during that first week, because I think it captures something true about the specific, disorienting shape early grief takes. I woke up on what would have been an entirely ordinary Tuesday, reached instinctively for my phone to check whether Diane had texted about dinner plans, a habit built across 3 decades of shared logistics, and sat there for nearly a full minute, phone in hand, before the previous week's events reassembled themselves in my memory. That specific, sickening lurch of remembering fresh, each morning, that the ordinary architecture of my life had been dismantled while I slept. I stopped going into my old accounting firm's office, even though I retained a small consulting arrangement with my former partner that occasionally required my presence, telling him I needed a few weeks away without fully explaining why, a request he granted immediately, and without questions, once word of what had happened at the party inevitably reached him through Charlotte's fairly close-knit business community. I remember, during that first week, receiving an outpouring of messages from friends who had been at the party, most of them careful, kind, uncertain how to address something none of them had ever witnessed before, a public humiliation of that specific magnitude. Several offered to have dinner, to check in, to simply be present, and I found myself, during those earliest days, unable to accept most of those offers, too raw to perform even the minimal social energy required to sit across a table from someone and discuss what had happened. My brother Frank, 3 years older than me and the only person alive who remembered our own parents' marriage well enough to understand exactly how much this particular betrayal echoed old family wounds neither of us talked about often, moved into something close to a rotating shift of checking on me during those first weeks, showing up most evenings with dinner I did not want to eat, sitting with me on the back porch until I was ready to talk, or, more often during that, simply ready to sit in silence with someone else present. He never once, during those earliest, hardest days, pushed me to talk before I was ready, understanding, I think from his own accumulated life experience, that some grief needs simply to be witnessed rather than processed on any particular timeline. Kevin and Tyler, my own sons, occupied a considerably more complicated position during those early weeks, one that added its own particular layer of pain to it. Both of them loved their mother, had grown up adoring her in the specific, uncomplicated way children adore a parent who showed up faithfully for every school play and every scraped knee across an entire childhood. And neither of them, in those first confused weeks, fully understood how to process what they had witnessed at that party. I want to describe, specifically, what that first week looked like for each of them separately, because their two paths toward eventually understanding the full truth diverged in ways that matter for the rest of this story. Tyler, 27 and living alone in his own apartment across town, called me the morning after the party in a state of visible distress, having apparently stayed up most of the night trying and failing to reach his mother for any kind of explanation beyond what he had witnessed directly in that country club dining room. "Dad," he said, his voice cracking in a way I had not heard since he was considerably younger, "I don't even know what to say to you right now, and I don't know what to say to Mom either. I keep replaying it in my head, and it doesn't make any more sense the 10th time than it did the first time." I told him, as steadily as I could manage given my own devastation, that I did not have full answers yet either, that I needed time to understand what had actually happened before I could offer him anything resembling clarity, and that I appreciated him reaching out even though I understood how confusing and painful this must be for him as well. Kevin, 32 years old and working in finance himself down in Atlanta, called me 3 days after the party, his voice careful in a way that told me he was trying very hard to remain neutral in a situation that offered him no comfortable neutral ground to stand on. "Dad," he said, "I don't even know what to say. Mom won't really talk about the specifics with me. She just keeps saying you two had grown apart and this had been building for a long time." I told him that I had genuinely not seen this coming, that whatever growing apart Diane was describing had apparently been happening considerably more in secret than in any conversation she had actually had with me directly. Kevin was quiet for a long moment. "I believe you, Dad," he finally said. "I just don't know what to do with believing you and still loving Mom at the same time." I told him he did not need to choose, not yet, that I was not asking him to. I understood, even in the depths of my own devastation, that forcing my sons to immediately and completely take my side would cost them something I did not want to be responsible for costing them. I did not yet understand how much that patience would eventually matter. Over the following weeks, I noticed Kevin and Tyler beginning to compare notes with each other more frequently than they typically did, late-night phone calls between Atlanta and Charlotte, that Tyler mentioned to me only in passing. Both of them, I think, trying to construct some shared understanding of what was actually happening to their family that neither of them could fully piece together alone. Tyler told me, weeks later, that those calls with Kevin during that early period had become one of the only places he felt he could voice his growing doubts about their mother's version of events, without either parent's feelings needing to be managed in the conversation. I want to pause here and tell you about Marcus Bell, my closest friend since our freshman year at UNC Chapel Hill, 42 years of friendship by that point, who happened to also be a retired attorney with 3 decades of family law experience before he transitioned into estate planning work in his final years of practice. Marcus had been at that birthday party, had watched the entire humiliating scene unfold from a table near the front of the room, and called me the following morning, his voice carrying the specific, controlled fury of a man who had watched someone he loved get ambushed in the cruelest possible public setting. I remember answering that call still sitting in the same chair I had collapsed into after finally arriving home the night before, still wearing the same clothes I had worn to my own birthday party, having not slept at all, and Marcus did not waste time on the ordinary pleasantries that usually opened our calls across 4 decades of friendship. "Jerry," he said, "I know you're not thinking clearly right now, and you shouldn't have to be. But I need you to hear one thing from me today, and I'll say it as many more times as you need to hear it. Whatever Diane has planned, and I promise you a scene that public and that calculated did not happen without planning, you need real legal representation, and you need it faster than feels comfortable given how raw everything is right now." I told him honestly that I could not imagine thinking about attorneys and legal strategy less than 12 hours after watching my marriage end in front of 40 people, that I needed time simply to process what had happened before I could think practically about what came next. Marcus was quiet for a moment before responding, and when he did, his voice had softened considerably, though the underlying urgency remained. "I understand that," he said. "I do. But Jerry, listen to the kind of person who stages a public announcement like that, who brings the other man to your own birthday party and has him stand up and toast to it. That is not someone who is going to give you the luxury of a slow, gentle transition into practical matters. Whatever comes next is likely already in motion. I would rather you be a week ahead of that timeline than a week behind it." I resisted that advice for almost 2 full weeks, still clinging to some diminishing hope that this might resolve itself into something less final than it clearly already was, before Marcus finally sat me down at his own kitchen table and told me something that broke through my paralysis in a way nothing else had managed to. "Jerry," he said, "I made a few calls. Quietly. I know some people in the divorce bar here in Charlotte. Your Derek is not a first-timer at this. There's a pattern, and it's not a good one. That conversation is where the second half of this story actually begins." I hired an attorney the following week, a sharp, meticulous woman named Vanessa Cole, recommended by Marcus specifically for her experience with what she called high-asset divorces involving what the legal community, she explained with grim humor, sometimes referred to as professional companions, men and occasionally women who developed genuine expertise in identifying, courting, and eventually financially exploiting recently vulnerable, wealthy individuals going through. Vanessa's office occupied the 14th floor of a downtown building with a view stretching out over the same skyline I had watched grow and change across 33 years of building my own practice below it. And she listened to the entire account of that birthday party, of the 18 months leading up to it, of Marcus's warning about a pattern, with a careful, professional attention that felt, for the first time since that humiliating evening, like standing on solid ground again. "Whitfield," she told me once I finished, "I'm going to be direct with you, because I think directness is what actually serves you right now more than sympathy does, even though you deserve considerable sympathy too. What you're describing, a public, humiliating, carefully staged announcement, months of documented behavioral changes, a significantly younger partner with what may be a pattern. This is not simply a marriage that organically fell apart. This looks to my professional eye like a marriage that was deliberately, strategically dismantled from the inside. And if that's accurate, we need to move quickly to protect what remains of your financial position before any further damage occurs. I should tell you here something I have not mentioned yet, because it reached me in that same first meeting, and it reframed everything. I had already been served. Diane's divorce petition arrived at my door 8 days after the party, a speed that surprised me at the time and did not surprise Vanessa at all. And when Vanessa reviewed the filing, she stopped on the financial affidavit attached to it and slid it across the desk to me with one finger resting on the notary block at the bottom. The affidavit, a document that takes real time to prepare, was signed, sworn, and notarized 19 days before my birthday. 19 days before she raised that glass, my wife had already stood in front of a notary and sworn out the paperwork to end our marriage, which meant the party was never an announcement at all. It was a performance staged on top of a decision already executed, sequenced so that the humiliation would land before the service of process did. "Mr. Whitfield," Vanessa said quietly, "I want you to understand what this date means for us. Nobody plans a spontaneous end. This is the first exhibit. And because the petition had been filed," she explained, "the court's machinery was now available to us as well. The discovery requests, the subpoena power, all of it, which mattered enormously for what came next." She recommended, that same afternoon, bringing in a forensic accountant to review our joint financial accounts for any unusual activity over the previous 18 months, a recommendation that struck me, given my own professional background, as simultaneously humiliating and entirely necessary. I had spent 33 years examining other families' finances for exactly this kind of hidden discrepancy. I had never imagined needing that same scrutiny applied to mine. And I owe you an honest answer here to the question I know half of you are already asking, because it is the right question, and I asked it of myself with considerably less kindness than you will. How does a forensic-minded accountant fail to notice $400,000 leaving his own accounts? The answer is the oldest joke in my profession, the one about the cobbler's children having no shoes, except it was never a joke in my house. It was a treaty. Sometime in the late 90s, after one too many evenings of me redlining our own grocery budget the way I redlined a client's travel expenses, Diane sat me down and proposed, reasonably, lovingly, that a man who spent 60 hours a week inside other people's ledgers deserved one set of accounts he never had to think about, and that she, perfectly capable and organized, would run the household finances, and I would simply live in them. It was, for 25 years, one of the healthiest arrangements in our marriage. She paid the bills, managed the statements, moved money between our accounts as ordinary life required, and every spring she handed me a tidy year-end summary she prepared herself. And every spring I reviewed the summary, her summary, instead of the underlying statements, because reviewing the summary was the treaty, and auditing my own wife would have felt like a violation of something we had built on. The statements themselves had gone paperless years earlier, delivered to the email address that managed them, which was hers. The account alerts went to the phone that managed them, which was hers. Nothing about that architecture was sinister when it was built. It was trust, given institutional form. But I want every couple listening to hear what I learned at the worst possible price. An arrangement built out of trust does not stop functioning when the trust does. The machine keeps running exactly as designed, faithfully, efficiently, in whatever direction the remaining hand on the wheel chooses to steer it, and the person who surrendered the wheel out of love will be the last to feel the turn. Vanessa connected me with Priya Sharma, a forensic accountant who had, coincidentally, trained briefly at my own old firm years earlier, before moving into more specialized litigation support work. A small, strange kindness in the middle of an otherwise devastating month. Working alongside someone who understood not just the numbers, but the specific culture and language of the profession I had spent my entire career inside. Priya's office occupied a modest suite in a business park on the outskirts of Charlotte, considerably less polished than Vanessa's downtown high-rise, but organized with the specific, meticulous precision I recognized immediately from my own decades in the profession. Filing systems and spreadsheet templates that told me, before she said a single word about her methodology, that I was working with someone genuinely skilled at exactly this kind of forensic reconstruction. Priya and I spent 3 full days going through 18 months of joint account statements, credit card records, and investment account activity. And I want to describe what those 3 days actually looked like, because I think the specific, grinding tedium of that process matters for understanding how thoroughly the eventual evidence was constructed. The first day, we simply organized, pulling every available statement from every joint account into a single chronological spreadsheet, a process that took nearly 9 hours and produced, by the end of it, a document tracking literally thousands of individual transactions across 18 months. Priya worked with a specific, patient thoroughness I found myself admiring even through my own exhaustion and grief, cross-referencing each unusual withdrawal against our stated household budget, flagging anything that fell outside normal spending patterns for further investigation. The second day, we began actually analyzing the patterns that first day's organization had surfaced. And this is where the small, unexplained cash withdrawals, 200 here, 300 there, began revealing their true accumulated shape. Priya, watching me stare at the total once she calculated it, $62,400 in unexplained cash withdrawals over 18 months, must have seen something in my expression, because she paused the work entirely for several minutes, simply sitting with me while I absorbed the specific, physical shock of watching 33 years of trust reduced to a spreadsheet total. "Jerry," she said, using my first name for the first time since we had begun working together, "I need you to understand something. This kind of discovery process is always painful, watching a marriage's entire hidden financial architecture get reduced to line items and totals. But the pain of knowing is still better than the pain of not knowing, even though it might not feel that way today, sitting here." The third day brought the discovery that would ultimately prove most significant: the pattern of larger transfers moving from our joint investment account into a separate account Diane had opened in her own name at a different bank. Transfers structured, Priya noted with visible professional concern, in amounts specifically calibrated to stay below the threshold that would typically trigger automatic reporting requirements. "Jerry," she told me, sliding a printed summary across the table between us, someone helped her think through how to move this money in a way specifically designed to avoid drawing attention. This is not how someone moves money when they are simply managing household expenses. This is how someone moves money when they are preparing for a divorce and want to minimize what shows up on the marital balance sheet before the filing happens. I remember sitting in Priya's office that third afternoon, watching autumn light slant through her office window, understanding that I was looking at documented, deliberate premeditation rather than any organic, gradual drift apart. A realization that shifted something fundamental in how I understood the previous 18 months of my own life. The total, once Priya finished her full accounting, came to just over $430,000, moved out of accounts I had spent 33 years building, over the course of 18 months, into an account controlled entirely by Diane. An account whose activity, once Vanessa's team subpoenaed the records, showed a series of considerably more troubling secondary transfers. Beginning with $40,000 and totaling $118,000 across 14 months, all flowing to a business entity called Elevate Wellness Partners LLC, an entity Vanessa's investigator discovered within days, owned entirely by Derek Voss, and, pointedly, not affiliated with the Elevate studio in any legal way despite the borrowed name. A shell Derek had christened deliberately so that payments to it would read, on any casual glance at a bank, like ordinary charges to the fitness studio where Diane trained. Even the name of his getaway car was camouflage. And since I promised you an accountant's honesty, let me give you the full reconciliation, because a number that large deserves to be itemized rather than waved at. Of the $430,000, roughly $62,000 had left as cash withdrawals, small, patient, structured, and, as cash always is, largely unrecoverable. $118,000 had flowed to Derek's shell entity. Just under $22,000 had gone to the retreats, the travel, the Sedona week, the accumulated cost of a courtship I had unknowingly financed. $28,000 had gone to Kevin, in a transfer I will tell you about shortly because it became one of the most painful discoveries of this entire ordeal. And the remaining $200,000, this is the detail that mattered most, was still sitting in Diane's separate account, positioned, waiting, not yet spent. Priya's read of that balance was clinical and, I believe, exactly correct. This was a war chest, assembled in advance of a filing she knew was coming, and the fact that it had merely been moved rather than spent is the single reason the eventual settlement could be repaired rather than merely mourned, because money that has been relocated can still be counted and clawed back and charged against a share. Money that is gone is just gone. I want to tell you what I learned about Derek Voss over the following 2 weeks, because I think it matters for understanding the full shape of what had actually happened to my marriage. Vanessa's private investigator, a careful, thorough man named Robert Castellan, who had spent 15 years working exactly this kind of case, produced a background report that reframed everything I thought I understood about the man who had toasted to my marriage end in that country club dining room. I met with Robert directly once, in a plain, functional office near the county courthouse, and I remember him laying out a timeline of Derek's career on a whiteboard, city by city, with the same methodical, patient precision I recognized from my own decades of forensic bookkeeping work. "Mr. Whitfield," he told me, "I've done this kind of investigation for a long time, and I want you to understand something before we go through the details. What your wife experienced, what you're now dealing with, this is not random bad luck. This is a professional pattern, refined over more than a decade, targeting a very specific type of vulnerable person with a very specific set of techniques. Understanding that doesn't make it hurt less, but I hope it at least helps you understand this was never really a fair fight to begin with." Derek Voss, 38 years old, had worked as a personal trainer and wellness consultant across 4 different states over the previous 12 years, moving cities with a regularity that Robert's report described, dryly, as considerably faster than career advancement alone would typically explain. Robert had traced Derek's employment history through a combination of public business licensing records, social media archaeology, and, in 2 cases, direct conversations with former employers who remembered him with a specific, cautious ambivalence, impressed by his client retention numbers, but uneasy, in retrospect, about exactly how he had achieved them. In each city, Robert's investigation found Derek had developed a pattern, building a client roster heavily weighted toward affluent women in their 50s and 60s, cultivating close personal relationships with a handful of them, and, in at least 3 previous documented cases across 3 different states, becoming romantically involved with a client during what appeared to be a vulnerable period in her own marriage, relationships that had, in each prior instance, coincided with significant, documented transfers of money from the woman's marital or personal accounts into accounts Derek controlled, either directly or through small business entities structured similarly to Elevate Wellness Partners. Robert showed me photographs, gathered from public social media accounts before Derek had apparently gone back and scrubbed much of his earlier online presence, showing him at fitness studios in Charleston, in Richmond, in Nashville, each stop following a remarkably similar template: arrival, rapid client base building among affluent older women, one particularly close relationship eventually emerging from that client base, and departure, typically within 18 months to moving on to the next city, just as the previous entanglements, financial and legal consequences began fully surfacing. One of those prior women, a woman in Nashville named Carol Hendricks, had actually filed a civil suit against Derek 4 years earlier alleging financial exploitation and undue influence, a suit that had ultimately settled out of court under terms that included a confidentiality agreement. Explaining, Robert noted, why this pattern had never surfaced publicly enough for someone doing a casual background check to easily discover it themselves. I asked Vanessa whether it would be possible to speak with Carol Hendricks directly, understanding that the confidentiality agreement likely constrained what she could formally discuss in any legal proceeding, but wanting, for reasons I did not fully articulate even to myself at the time, to hear directly from another person who had lived through some version of what I was currently living through. Vanessa made the introduction carefully, through Robert's own established contact with Carol from his investigative work, and Carol agreed, after several days of consideration, to speak with me by phone, off the record, understanding I was not asking her to violate any legal agreement but simply hoping to understand. Carol Hendricks turned out to be 63 years old, a retired pediatric nurse from Nashville, and her voice on that phone call carried a specific, weary recognition the moment I explained why I was calling. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, "I am so sorry. I want you to know before you say anything else that whatever guilt or confusion you're carrying about not seeing this sooner, please let some of that go. I spent 2 years asking myself the same questions. Derek is very, very good at what he does." She told me her own story, over nearly 90 minutes on that call, a story that echoed my own with an unsettling, precise similarity. Her husband of 31 years, a successful orthopedic surgeon, had grown increasingly distant during her own recovery from a difficult hip replacement surgery, a vulnerable period during which she had started working with a personal trainer named Derek at a boutique studio not unlike Elevate, a trainer who had over the following year become her closest confidant, encouraging her, gently and repeatedly, to consider what she actually wanted out of the room. Language she recognized, hearing me describe Diane's own transformed vocabulary, as almost identically rehearsed to what Derek had once said to her. "He's not stupid," Carol told me. "He doesn't rush it. He spends months, sometimes over a year, just listening, making a woman feel more genuinely heard than her own husband has managed to make her feel in years, sometimes decades. By the time the actual affair starts, and by the time the money starts moving, you've already been convinced, slowly, patiently, that this is the first person who's ever truly understood you. It doesn't feel like manipulation from the inside. It feels like finally being seen." I asked her carefully, about the financial details of her own case, and she confirmed a pattern remarkably similar to what Priya had uncovered in my own accounts: gradual transfers over roughly 14 months, funneled eventually into a business entity Derek controlled, totaling just under $300,000 by the time her own husband's attorney uncovered the full scope of it. I settled, she told me, because by that point I was exhausted, and because my own attorney told me a public trial would drag Derek's full pattern into the open in a way that might actually help other women down the road, but would also mean reliving every humiliating detail in open court. I have thought, more than once since, about whether settling quietly actually did other women a disservice, whether staying quiet let him move on to find someone like your wife too. I am glad Robert found you before too much more damage was done. I am glad you're not settling quietly. That conversation stayed with me for weeks afterward. A strange, unexpected kinship formed entirely out of shared devastation with a woman I had never met in person, and it hardened something in my own resolve that had, until that call, still carried some small residual hope that Diane's involvement might turn out to be more innocent, more confused, than the pattern Robert's investigation was increasingly suggesting. I sat with that report for a long time, understanding now that my marriage had not simply fallen apart under the ordinary pressures of time and distance. It had been deliberately, systematically targeted by a man with a documented pattern of doing exactly this. And Diane, whether fully complicit in understanding the mechanics or simply swept along by a manipulation she did not recognize for what it was, had allowed, and in some ways actively participated in, the deliberate draining of assets I had spent 33 years building. I confronted Diane directly about 2 weeks after receiving Robert's full report, at her request actually, since she had reached out asking to meet and talk things through now that, in her words, some of the initial emotion had settled. Before that meeting with Diane, though, I want to tell you about something I did that Vanessa specifically advised against. Something I am not entirely proud of, but which I think matters for understanding how raw and unpredictable grief can make even a normally careful, methodical person. 4 days after receiving Robert's full background report on Derek, I drove to elevate myself, sitting in my car across the street for almost 40 minutes, watching people come and go through that moody, exposed brick entrance, before finally deciding, against every ounce of professional advice I had received, to walk inside. The front desk staff recognized me, I think, from Diane's own account information on file, and there was a brief, uncomfortable pause before a young woman asked, carefully, whether she could help me with something. I asked to speak with Derek directly. She disappeared into the back for several minutes, long enough that I nearly left before she returned, and Derek Voss himself emerged from a hallway behind the reception desk, dressed in the same kind of expensive athletic, where I imagined he wore for every client interaction, his expression carefully neutral in a way that told me he had likely rehearsed this exact possible encounter more than once. "Mr. Whitfield," he said, extending a hand I did not take. "I understand this must be an incredibly difficult time for you." I did not raise my voice. I want to be clear about that, because Diane's later legal filing would claim otherwise. I told him calmly that I knew about Nashville, about Carol Hendricks, about the pattern Robert's investigation had traced across 3 other states, and that I wanted him to understand, directly from me, that I intended to pursue every available legal avenue to ensure he faced real consequences this time rather than another quiet, confidential settlement. Derek's careful neutral expression flickered, just slightly, something colder and more calculating passing behind his eyes before the practiced warmth resettled back into place. "Mr. Whitfield," he said, his voice smooth and unhurried, "I think you're working from some seriously outdated and inaccurate information. Diane and I have built something real together. I understand that's painful for you to accept, but making threats isn't going to change what's actually true." I told him I had not made a single threat, that I had simply stated facts and my intentions, and that he was welcome to have his own attorney contact mine going forward. I left within minutes of arriving, having said everything I had actually driven there to say, and I understand now, with the clarity of hindsight, that this single encounter, brief and factually accurate as it was on my part, became the seed Diane and Derek would later attempt to grow into the fabricated protective order narrative, reshaping a calm, factual confrontation into something considerably more threatening in the retelling. I told Vanessa about the visit that same evening, expecting and receiving a measured but clear reprimand. "Jerry," she said, "I understand the impulse, I genuinely do, but you've just handed them a factual event they can reshape into whatever narrative serves them best. From this point forward, I need every interaction to go through me or not happen at all." I agreed, and I did not repeat that particular mistake. But the visit had already happened, and its consequences, reshaped and exaggerated, would surface again several weeks later in ways I did not yet anticipate. We met at a coffee shop neutral to both of us, and I want to describe honestly what that conversation revealed, because it became, in its own way, the second major turning point in this entire story. Diane arrived looking, for the first time since the party, genuinely uncertain rather than confidently triumphant, and she spent the first several minutes of that conversation in territory I had not expected, apologizing for the specific cruelty of how she had ended things, acknowledging that the public announcement had been needlessly humiliating, telling me, with what appeared to be real tears, that she had let herself get caught up in something she was only now starting to fully understand the shape of herself. I asked her directly, at that point, about the $430,000, about Elevate Wellness Partners, about the pattern Roberts' investigation had uncovered in 3 other cities. Her face changed considerably at that specific question, the careful vulnerability replaced by something more guarded, more calculating, and she told me that the money had simply been an investment in a wellness business venture she and Derek were building together, that I was misunderstanding a legitimate business relationship as something more sinister, and that continuing to investigate Derek's past would only make our eventual divorce settlement considerably more contentious and expensive for both of us. I understood, sitting across from her in that coffee shop, that this entire meeting, the apology, the tears, the careful vulnerability, had itself been another calculated performance, an attempt to soften my resolve just enough that I might quietly drop the forensic investigation before it produced anything Diane and Derek could not adequately explain away. I did not drop it. I told her, as calmly as I could manage, that Vanessa and Priya would be presenting the full financial picture through the appropriate legal channels, and that whatever business venture she believed she was building with Derek would need to withstand exactly that scrutiny. 2 weeks after that coffee shop conversation, Vanessa called me with news that shifted the entire tenor of the proceedings. Diane's attorney had filed an emergency motion requesting a temporary protective order against me, citing, in the filing, what it described as increasingly erratic and threatening behavior on my part since the birthday party, including, the motion alleged, an incident where I had allegedly followed Diane's car, and another where I had allegedly shown up uninvited at Elevate demanding to speak with Derek in a manner staff described as intimidating. I want to be precise here about what was true and what was fabricated, because the distinction matters considerably. I had, as I described earlier, gone to Elevate once, briefly, calmly, stating facts rather than threats. That single factual event had been reshaped in the filing into something considerably darker. Staff quoted anonymously describing me as agitated and intimidating, a characterization of my calm, brief visit that bore only a passing resemblance to what had. The allegation about following Diane's car, however, was invented entirely, a fabrication with no underlying factual event at all, constructed, I came to understand, specifically to establish a pattern serious enough to justify emergency judicial intervention. I sat in Vanessa's office staring at the filing with a specific, cold disbelief that I understand now was its own kind of naivety. The assumption that a false accusation could not actually gain legal traction simply because it was false, and largely fabricated. Jerry, Vanessa told me, her expression grim, this is a fairly common tactic in cases like this, particularly once the other side realizes financial misconduct is about to be exposed. Manufacturing a narrative of instability or threat on your part accomplishes two things simultaneously. It generates sympathy for Diane going into settlement negotiations, and it potentially discredits your own credibility right when your financial evidence is becoming most damaging to their position. And unfortunately, your one actual visit to Elevate gives them a real event to distort, which makes this considerably harder to dismiss outright than if you had never gone. I understood, hearing that, the full weight of the mistake I had made driving to that studio weeks earlier, a mistake born entirely of raw, unprocessed grief rather than any genuine threat, now weaponized into something I would need to fight my way back out from underneath. The hearing for that protective order took place 11 days later, in a small courtroom I had never had reason to enter across 33 years of otherwise law-abiding adult life. I remember sitting in the hallway outside that courtroom beforehand, Vanessa beside me reviewing her notes one final time, Frank having insisted on accompanying me, despite my telling him it was not necessary, sitting 2 rows behind me in the gallery once proceedings began, a steady, silent presence I found myself grateful for more than I expected to be. The courtroom itself was smaller than I had imagined, wood-paneled, a single judge's bench rather than the elaborate setups I associated with courtroom dramas, and Judge Patricia Osai entered with the brisk, unhurried efficiency of someone who had presided over a great many contentious proceedings and had learned long ago not to let the emotional weight of any single case slow down her careful attention to the actual evidence. Gregory Hastings, Diane's attorney at that stage, presented the petition's core allegations methodically, calling Diane herself to testify first. I watched her take the stand, and I want to be honest that some old, deep part of me still ached watching her, still remembered 33 years of loving this woman even as I sat there fighting to establish, in a court of law, that her sworn testimony against me was substantially fabricated. Diane's testimony described a husband she said she barely recognized anymore, someone she characterized as increasingly unpredictable and frightening since the party, someone whose calm exterior, she suggested, might be concealing something considerably more volatile underneath. She described the alleged incident of my following her car with specific, detailed particulars, a description that struck me, listening to it, as chillingly precise for an event that had simply never occurred. Vanessa's cross-examination, when it came, was methodical and devastating in the specific, quiet way I had come to understand was her particular professional gift. She began by establishing, through my own detailed calendar and a corroborating scheduled meeting confirmation, that I had been sitting with Priya Sharma reviewing financial documents at the exact date and time Diane's testimony specified for the alleged car following incident, A scheduled professional meeting Priya herself was prepared to testify to under oath, having kept, as forensic accountants routinely do, meticulous time-stamped records of every client session. Miss Whitfield, Vanessa asked, her voice calm and precise. Can you describe for the court the specific route you allege Mr. Whitfield followed your vehicle along? Diane hesitated, offering a description that grew progressively vaguer under gentle but persistent follow-up questioning, ultimately conceding that she had not, in fact, directly witnessed my car behind hers, but had been told about the incident secondhand, a concession that visibly shifted the courtroom's attention, Judge Osai making a careful, deliberate note. Vanessa then turned to the Elevate visit, establishing through subpoenaed staff scheduling records, and crucially, through Derek Voss's own internal incident reporting system, that no formal complaint or incident report had ever actually been filed by any Elevate staff member regarding my brief visit, despite the petition's specific claim that staff had characterized my behavior as intimidating. If staff genuinely experienced Mr. Whitfield's visit as intimidating, Vanessa asked the studio's own operations manager, called as a witness, would that not be exactly the kind of incident your studio's own safety protocols require documenting? The operations manager, clearly uncomfortable, confirmed that yes, such an incident would typically be documented, and that no such documentation existed for the date in question. Judge Osai, at the conclusion of that hearing, denied the protective order, noting for the record that the evidence presented in support of the petition appeared substantially uncorroborated and inconsistent with documented facts. Language Vanessa later told me was about as close to an explicit judicial finding of fabrication as courts typically allow themselves in these proceedings. She further noted, addressing Gregory Hastings directly, that she expected considerably more rigorous verification of client testimony before future filings of this nature crossed her docket. I walked out of that courtroom with Frank's hand steady on my shoulder, Vanessa beside me already discussing next steps in the low, efficient voice I had come to associate with genuine relief rather than mere professional satisfaction. And I remember feeling, for the first time since that humiliating birthday party months earlier, something that actually resembled the beginning of solid ground beneath my feet again. I want to tell you about the weeks following that hearing, because they represent, I think, the hardest emotional stretch of this entire ordeal, harder in some ways than the original party itself. Because by that point the raw shock had faded into something more like a long, grinding exhaustion, the specific fatigue of fighting a battle you did not choose and cannot simply walk away from. My brother Frank remained a steady presence throughout those weeks, showing up most evenings whether I wanted company or not, understanding, with the particular wisdom of an older sibling who had watched our own parents' difficult marriage decades earlier, exactly when to talk and exactly when to simply sit quietly beside me on the back porch while I worked through whatever needed working through that particular evening. Marcus, beyond his initial advice connecting me with Vanessa, continued checking in weekly, occasionally joining Frank and me for dinner, bringing the specific, dry legal humor that had helped both of us survive considerably harder moments across 4 decades of friendship, moments neither of us discussed often, but both of us remembered clearly enough to draw strength from during a crisis like this one. Kevin and Tyler, my sons, occupied the most emotionally complicated position of anyone in my life during those weeks. And I want to be honest about the specific pain of watching my own children work through their own confusion and divided loyalty, while I was fighting to simply hold myself together. Tyler, 27 years old and still living in Charlotte, came by my house most Sundays during that stretch, sitting with me over coffee, careful never to fully take sides, but increasingly, I could tell, troubled by pieces of information filtering through to him from mutual friends, from his own observations of his mother's behavior, from a growing unease he did not yet have full language to articulate. "Dad," he said to me one Sunday, about 6 weeks after the protective order hearing, "I talked to one of Mom's old friends from the school district. She told me Mom had been talking about Derek to people for almost a year before the party. Not casually. Like planning things. I don't know what to do with that information, honestly. It doesn't match the story Mom's been telling us about this all just kind of happening." I told him, as gently as I could manage, that I was not asking him to choose, that I understood how impossibly difficult it was to reconcile new information against a lifetime of loving his mother, and that whatever he eventually came to understand about what had actually happened, my door would remain open to him regardless of his own timeline for working through it. Kevin's path toward understanding proved considerably more difficult, complicated by his own financial entanglement with his mother that neither of us fully understood the shape of until considerably later in this process. About 2 months after the party, during a routine review of financial records Priya was conducting as part of the broader forensic accounting, a specific transaction surfaced that would eventually become one of the most painful discoveries of this entire ordeal. 11 months before the party, roughly matching the same period when the unexplained withdrawals from our joint account had begun, Diane had wired Kevin $28,000, described in her own records as a loan to help him with a down payment on his Atlanta condo. Money Kevin had gratefully accepted, understanding it as coming from his parents' shared retirement savings the same way considerably smaller gifts had come from those same accounts across his entire. What Priya's investigation revealed, and what I had to be the one to eventually explain to my own son, was that this $28,000 had been transferred not from our joint retirement accounts at all, but from the very same account Diane had been quietly funneling money into from our marital assets, meaning that Kevin's condo down payment had been, functionally, part of the broader pattern of asset dissipation Diane and Derek had been orchestrating. Money moved out of our marriage and then partially redirected toward our own son in a way that, Vanessa explained carefully, actually complicated rather than simplified the eventual accounting of marital versus separate property in the divorce proceedings. I called Kevin the evening I learned this detail, uncertain how to have this particular conversation with a son already navigating so much confusion and divided loyalty. And I want to describe what happened on that call, because I think it represents the beginning of the actual turning point in my relationship with both of my sons. "Kevin," I said, once I had explained the situation as clearly and carefully as I could manage, "I need you to know I am not telling you this to make you feel guilty about accepting help from your mother. You had no way of knowing where that money actually came from, or how it fit into a larger pattern. But I think you deserve to understand the full picture of what's actually been happening, because I think you've been trying to hold two completely incompatible versions of your mother in your head at the same time, and I don't think that's fair to ask of you anymore." There was a long silence on the line, long enough that I genuinely worried the call had dropped, before Kevin finally spoke, his voice considerably smaller than I had heard it in years. "Dad," he said, "I think I've known something was wrong with the story Mom's been telling us for a while now. I just didn't want it to be true, because if it's true, it means the version of Mom I've believed in my whole life isn't actually who she really is, or at least isn't who she's been for the last couple years." I told him I understood exactly that particular kind of grief, that I was living through my own version of it every single day, mourning not just a marriage, but the specific, trusted version of a person I had spent 3 decades believing I fully knew. I want to tell you about one particular evening, about 3 weeks before that formal mediation began, because I think it captures something important about how I managed to walk into that conference room with as much steadiness as I ultimately did. Frank organized it, without much warning, showing up at my door on a Thursday evening and telling me only to grab a jacket, that we were going somewhere. He drove me to his own house, where I found, considerably to my surprise, Marcus already seated at Frank's kitchen table alongside Frank's wife Susan, and, a few minutes later, both of my sons arriving separately, Kevin having driven up from Atlanta specifically for the evening without telling me in advance. Frank had, it turned out, quietly coordinated the entire gathering over the previous week, understanding, with the particular instinct of an older brother who had watched me grow increasingly withdrawn and exhausted across months of legal proceedings, that I needed something considerably more sustaining than another evening spent reviewing documents with Vanessa or sitting alone in my own increasingly quiet house. We did not talk much about the divorce that evening, not directly, not in the exhausting, technical language of asset division and forensic accounting that had come to dominate so much of my daily life. Susan made a pot roast, the specific kind of unglamorous, comforting meal I associated with the best evenings of my own childhood, and we sat around Frank's kitchen table for nearly 4 hours, telling old stories, Marcus recounting, with considerable embellishment, a story about the two of us nearly failing an entire semester of college statistics together, Kevin and Tyler laughing in a way I had not heard from either of them in months. At one point, late in the evening, Tyler asked me directly how I was actually doing, cutting through the deliberately lighter conversation with a directness that caught me somewhat off guard. I told him honestly that I was tired in a way I did not fully have words for, that I was proud of how the legal process had unfolded so far, and that I was also genuinely frightened of the mediation still ahead, uncertain how I would hold myself together watching Diane's testimony directly rather than through Vanessa's careful second-hand summaries. Frank, sitting across the table, said something then that I have thought about often since. "Jerry," he said, "you don't have to hold yourself together alone in that room. Look around this table. Every single one of us is going to be thinking about you the entire time you're in there, whether we're physically present or not. That's not nothing. That's actually the whole point of having people." I did not fully appreciate, sitting at that table, exactly how much that particular evening would matter 3 weeks later, walking into that mediation conference room with Frank's steady presence in the gallery, with Marcus's decades of friendship quietly informing every piece of legal strategy Vanessa and I had developed together, with both of my sons present specifically because that dinner had reminded all of us collectively that whatever fractured in the coming weeks, the people gathered around that kitchen table represented something considerably more solid than whatever Diane and Derek had spent 18 months quietly dismantling. The formal divorce mediation, scheduled roughly 4 months after that initial birthday party, took place in a conference room at Vanessa's own firm, a considerably less adversarial setting than a full courtroom trial, though the stakes, given everything Priya's forensic accounting had uncovered, remained substantial enough that both sides arrived with full legal teams, and the specific, controlled tension of people who understood exactly how much was actually on the table. The conference room itself occupied the corner of Vanessa's firm's 14th floor, floor-to-ceiling windows on 2 sides overlooking the same Charlotte skyline I had watched grow and change across 33 years of building my own practice below it. A long mahogany table down the center, water glasses, and legal pads arranged with the careful precision of a firm that handled matters of this magnitude regularly. I arrived early, at Vanessa's specific instruction, giving us time to arrange documents and review, one final time, the precise order in which we intended to present the accumulated evidence of the previous 4 months. Diane arrived with her own attorney, a polished, confident man named Gregory Hastings who specialized, according to his firm's materials, in complex asset division cases. And I watched Diane's posture during those opening minutes, considerably less confident than the woman who had toasted to our marriage end 4 months earlier, something in her expression suggesting she understood, even before the substantive proceedings began, that the ground beneath her position had shifted considerably since that triumphant evening. She wore a navy suit I did not recognize, her hair pulled back more severely than I remembered her typically wearing it, and she did not meet my eyes as she took her seat across the wide table from me. Kevin and Tyler were both present as well, not as formal parties to the proceeding, but at my own request, understanding, once I explained my reasoning, that whatever emerged in that room deserved to be witnessed directly by both of them rather than filtered secondhand through whichever parent chose to characterize it favorably afterward. They sat together near the back of the room, Tyler's leg bouncing with visible nervous energy, Kevin sitting very still in the specific, controlled way I recognized from his own childhood whenever he was steeling himself for something difficult. The mediator, a semi-retired family court judge named Robert Delacroix, who had transitioned into private mediation work specifically for cases involving this scale of complexity, opened proceedings with a brief explanation of the process, emphasizing that his role was to facilitate a resolution both parties could accept, though his recommendations, given his judicial background, would carry considerable weight if the matter eventually proceeded to formal litigation. Gregory Hastings opened for Diane's side, presenting a narrative I had, by that point, anticipated fairly precisely, characterizing our marriage as having genuinely deteriorated over several years due to what he called irreconcilable differences in how each of us envisioned our later decades together, framing Diane's relationship with Derek as a symptom of that deterioration rather than its cause, and requesting an equal division of marital assets without any adjustment for the transfers Priya's accounting had identified, which he characterized as legitimate independent financial decisions within Diane's own reasonable discretion as a co-owner of those accounts. Vanessa's presentation, when it came, was methodical and devastating in exactly the way I had come to expect from months of working alongside her. She laid out, document by document, the full pattern Priya's forensic accounting had uncovered, beginning with a timeline chart projected onto a screen at the end of the room, showing the correlation between Diane's enrollment at Elevate and the beginning of unexplained account withdrawals, then the correlation between Derek's own business entity formation and the acceleration of larger transfers, then the specific structuring of those transfers to remain below automatic. She walked the room through Robert Castellan's investigation into Derek's documented pattern across 3 previous states, presenting, with the mediator's permission, portions of the Nashville lawsuit's publicly available court filings alongside my own account of speaking directly with Carol Hendricks, establishing a pattern considerably too specific and too repeated to credibly characterize as coincidence. And finally, she presented the fabricated protective order petition, alongside Judge Osai's own written finding that its central allegations had been substantially uncorroborated, a piece of evidence Vanessa specifically noted spoke not just to the financial dispute at hand, but to the broader credibility of testimony the mediation would need to weigh going forward. Gregory Hastings attempted, at several points, to characterize the financial transfers as legitimate business investment decisions Diane had every right to make independently, arguing that marital assets, once commingled, belonged equally to both spouses regardless of which spouse initiated a particular transfer. But Vanessa's response, backed by Priya's detailed forensic documentation, made clear that the specific structuring of those transfers, deliberately calibrated to avoid reporting thresholds, time to accelerate specifically once divorce proceedings became likely, and flowing directly to an entity controlled by a man with a documented pattern of exactly this kind of financial exploitation, told a story considerably harder to characterize as innocent, independent decision-making than Hastings's opening framing had suggested. "Mr. Hastings," Vanessa said at one point, her voice calm but pointed, "are you prepared to argue on the record that a pattern replicated across 3 separate states, involving 3 separate marriages, structured specifically to avoid financial reporting requirements, represents nothing more than ordinary spousal financial independence?" Hastings did not have a strong answer to that particular question, and I watched something shift in Robert Delacroix's expression as well, the careful, neutral attention of a mediator beginning to lean, almost imperceptibly, toward the party whose evidence was considerably more thoroughly documented. It was during this portion of the mediation, watching the full financial picture laid out in careful, undeniable documentary detail, that I watched something in Kevin's expression finally, completely change. He had been sitting quietly through the earlier presentations, his jaw tightening progressively as Vanessa moved through the timeline, but it was the specific moment Priya's summary document flashed onto the screen, the line item showing the $28,000 transfer to Kevin himself, cross-referenced against the broader pattern of dissipated marital assets, that something in him finally broke open completely. "Mom," he said, his voice cutting through the room before either attorney had finished speaking, "is this true? Did you actually move that much money out before telling any of us what was really happening? Was the money you gave me for my condo actually part of this?" Robert Delacroix, clearly accustomed to emotional interruptions in proceedings of this nature, did not immediately intervene, allowing the moment to play out with a kind of careful, deliberate patience. Diane's composure, which had held reasonably steady through most of Vanessa's presentation, finally broke at that specific question from her own son. "Kevin," she started, her voice thick, "it wasn't like that. I was scared. Derek helped me understand that I needed to protect myself financially before things got complicated. I didn't fully understand at the time how it would all look laid out this way." "You didn't understand," Kevin repeated, his voice rising now in a way I had genuinely never heard from my careful, measured older son before, standing up from his chair near the back of the room. "Mom, you took money out of Dad's retirement, money you both spent 30 years building, and you used part of it to help me buy a condo without telling either of us where it actually came from, while planning this entire scene with a man who's apparently done this exact same thing to other women in other states. That's not confusion. That's a plan." Tyler, beside him, had gone very pale, staring at his mother with an expression I recognized, painfully, as the exact moment a final piece of denial finally, completely collapsed. Gregory Hastings asked for a brief recess. Diane did not immediately follow him out of the room, sitting instead in stunned silence as both of her sons looked at her with an expression I recognized, uncomfortably, as the exact mirror of what I imagined my own face must have looked like standing in that country club parking lot 4 months earlier. When proceedings resumed roughly 40 minutes later, something in the entire room's dynamic had shifted. Hastings, clearly having used the recess to have a difficult conversation with his own client, opened with a considerably more conciliatory posture, indicating Diane's willingness to accept the dissipated assets being treated as an advance against her eventual settlement share, a significant concession from the position his opening statement had staked out barely an hour earlier. The remainder of that mediation session, and the two follow-up sessions that occurred over the following 3 weeks, worked through the detailed mechanics of that settlement, Priya's forensic accounting providing the specific dollar figures, Vanessa negotiating the precise terms, Kevin and Tyler present for portions of each session, watching their parents' 3-decade partnership formally, legally, permanently dissolve across a series of increasingly technical financial conversations that bore almost no resemblance to the warm, celebratory toast Diane had once promised would define that 60th birthday evening. What followed, over the remaining hours of that mediation session and the weeks that followed it, was not an immediate, complete reconciliation between Diane and our sons, and I think it matters that I tell you that honestly. Kevin barely spoke to his mother for almost 2 months following that mediation, working through his own considerable grief and anger largely through conversations with Tyler, and increasingly, with me, the three of us finding a new, more honest footing with each other, even as the larger family structure we had all grown up inside continued fracturing around us. The financial settlement that eventually emerged, negotiated over the following 3 months through Vanessa and Gregory Hastings, accounted fully for the dissipated marital assets, treating the $430,000 as an advance against Diane's eventual settlement share rather than money simply lost to the marital estate. A resolution Vanessa described as considerably more favorable than I had initially dared hope, for given how thoroughly Diane and Derek had apparently believed their financial maneuvering would go unnoticed and unchallenged. Derek Voss, once Robert Castellan's full investigation, and the mediation documentation became part of the formal record, found himself facing considerably more serious consequences than simply losing access to Diane's remaining assets. Carol Hendricks, the woman from Nashville whose earlier civil suit against Derek had settled confidentially, was contacted, with her permission, by Vanessa's office, and agreed, given the pattern now emerging across multiple states, to cooperate with a broader civil fraud investigation that ultimately drew in at least one additional woman from a third state, a coordinated legal effort that, as of the time I am telling you this story, remains ongoing, but has already resulted in Derek losing his personal training certification and facing a formal civil fraud complaint seeking damages considerably larger than what he had managed to extract from any single relationship on its own. I want to tell you about the conversation Kevin and I had about 3 months after that mediation, because I think it matters more than any of the financial resolution. We sat together on my back porch, the same porch where Frank had spent so many evenings simply sitting with me through the worst of this entire ordeal, a bottle of wine between us that neither of us drank much of, the late spring evening warm enough that we did not need jackets, cicadas beginning their evening chorus somewhere in the trees beyond the yard, and Kevin asked me the question I think he had been working up the courage to ask for weeks. "Dad, do you think Mom ever really loved you, or was some version of this always coming?" I sat with that question for a long moment before answering, understanding that Kevin deserved my most honest possible answer rather than whatever version might feel most comfortable for either of us in the moment. I told him honestly that I believed, for most of our 33 years together, Diane had loved me as genuinely and completely as anyone can love another person across that much accumulated shared life. That I remembered, vividly, decades of small, unperformed kindnesses that no one manufactures for an audience, sitting up with me during my first difficult tax season, holding him as a newborn at 4 in the morning singing off-key lullabies neither of us actually, managing an entire funeral's logistics the year my own father died, so I could simply grieve without organizing anything myself. I also told him that I believed something had shifted in her, gradually, in ways I still did not fully understand, that made her vulnerable to exactly the kind of deliberate manipulation Derek had apparently specialized in perfecting across multiple states and multiple marriages. A vulnerability I suspected had roots somewhere in her own unspoken fears about aging, about relevance, about whatever specific insecurities Derek had learned to identify and gently, patiently exploit across their first months together before any money or romance entered the picture at all. I told him that both of those things could be true simultaneously. Real love in the earlier decades and genuine exploitation in the final chapter, and that untangling exactly where one ended and the other began was likely a project that would take considerably longer than either of us currently had patience for, possibly longer than either of us would ever fully complete. Kevin nodded slowly, absorbing that, staring out at the darkening yard for a long moment before speaking again. I keep thinking about how much of my adult life I built assuming Mom and Dad's marriage was the model, he said, his voice quiet. The thing I was supposed to build my own relationships toward eventually. I've been with Rachel for 2 years now, and I catch myself sometimes measuring things against what I thought you and Mom had. I don't know how to hold onto that model anymore, knowing how it actually ended. I told him that a marriage ending badly did not erase the genuine years of good that preceded it. That 30 years of Sunday dinners and school plays and quiet, ordinary love were not somehow retroactively fictional just because the final chapter had turned out to be a betrayal neither of us saw coming. And that I hoped, eventually, he would find his own way to hold both truths without either one canceling the other out entirely. I told him that the actual lesson, if there was one worth taking from all of this, was not that love itself was untrustworthy, but that even genuine love needs ongoing honesty and attention to survive. That Diane and I had, somewhere in our final years together, stopped doing the harder work of actually staying curious about each other, and that vulnerability, left unattended long enough, eventually finds whatever door happens to be standing open. Kevin was quiet again for a long moment, and then he said something that I have carried with me since, turning it over often in the months that followed. "Dad," he said, "I think what I actually want to build isn't a marriage that looks like yours and Mom's used to look from the outside. I think I want to build one that could survive being looked at this closely if it ever had to be. One that wouldn't collapse under this kind of examination." I told him that was, I believed, exactly the right lesson to take from all of this, and that I was, despite everything, considerably prouder of the man sitting across from me on that porch than I had words to fully express in the moment. 6 months have passed since that 60th birthday party where Diane raised her glass and ended our marriage in front of everyone I loved. I sold the house we had raised our sons in 3 months ago, not because I could not afford to stay, but because every room held a version of a life I understood now had been, in its final years at least, considerably more complicated than I had allowed myself to see clearly while I was living inside it. I want to walk you through those 6 months in more detail than I have so far, because I think the specific, unglamorous texture of slow recovery matters as much as any single dramatic turning point in this story. The first month after that final mediation session was, honestly, the hardest of the entire ordeal, harder in some ways than the immediate aftermath of the party itself, because the adrenaline of active fighting, of investigation and legal strategy and courtroom vindication, had finally receded, leaving behind only the quiet, unglamorous work of actually rebuilding an ordinary life. I remember waking up most mornings during that stretch with a specific, hollow disorientation, reaching instinctively for a phone to share some small morning thought with Diane before remembering, freshly each time, that this particular habit no longer had anywhere to land. Frank insisted, during that first month, on a standing Tuesday and Thursday dinner arrangement, showing up at 7 each of those evenings whether I felt like company or not, understanding, with the particular wisdom of an older sibling, that structure and routine matter more during genuine grief than any single profound conversation. We did not always talk about the divorce during those dinners. Often we talked about nothing at all, old college stories, a Panthers game neither of us particularly cared about, the specific comfort of simply not being alone in a quiet house on a Tuesday evening. I bought a smaller place closer to downtown 2 months after the mediation concluded, a renovated loft with tall windows and considerably less square footage than Diane and I had needed for a family of 4. And I have found, in these past months, a strange, quiet satisfaction in building something entirely my own for the first time since my 20s, choosing furniture and paint colors, and a daily rhythm that answers to no one's preferences but my own. I painted the main living space a deep forest green, a color Diane would have called too dark for a small space, and I find myself, most evenings, genuinely loving exactly the choice she would have talked me out of making 20 years earlier. Marcus and I have resumed the regular chess games we let lapse during the busiest years of both our careers, an old ritual rediscovered in the middle of an entirely unwanted new chapter, meeting most Wednesday evenings at the same coffee shop where we used to play as young men still building our respective careers, both of us considerably grayer now, both of us, I think. Quietly grateful to have found our way back to a friendship that 4 decades of professional demands had allowed to become intermittent rather than constant. Tyler comes by most Sundays still, a tradition that started during the darkest weeks of this ordeal and has simply continued because, he told me recently, he likes who I am becoming on the other side of all of this, steadier, he said, and somehow more myself than he remembers me being even before any of this happened. We have started cooking together on those Sunday evenings, something Diane and I never particularly did together, and Tyler, it turns out, has a genuine talent for it that neither of us had previously discovered, spending considerable time researching recipes during the week specifically to surprise me with something new each Sunday. Kevin and Diane have begun, cautiously, tentatively, rebuilding some version of a relationship, though it looks nothing like the closeness that existed before. Careful monthly phone calls rather than the easy weekly conversations that used to define their bond. A distance I understand Kevin needs, and one I have made a deliberate point of never pressuring him to close faster than feels honest to him. He moved back to Charlotte 3 months ago, a decision he told me was only partially related to everything that had happened, though I suspect, without saying so directly, that wanting to be closer to family during this particular chapter played more of a role than he has fully acknowledged even to himself. I started, 4 months ago, volunteering one afternoon a week with a local nonprofit that provides free financial literacy counseling to people navigating divorce, particularly women and men discovering, often for the first time, exactly how vulnerable a shared financial life can leave you when a partner decides, for whatever reason, to begin quietly building an exit. I sit with people now, using 33 years of professional forensic accounting experience alongside 6 months of considerably more personal, painful expertise, helping them learn to read their own financial statements with the same careful, suspicious attention I once reserved only for clients rather than my own marriage. I want to tell you about one specific client from that volunteer work, because I think her situation crystallized something important for me about why this work has come to matter so much during my own recovery. A woman named Denise, 61 years old, came to one of my sessions 3 months ago, midway through her own divorce, describing a pattern of financial secrecy from her husband that echoed my own experience closely enough that I found myself, more than once during our conversation, having to consciously separate her story from my own memories. I helped her identify, over 2 sessions, a series of transfers her husband had been quietly making into a separate account for nearly a year, evidence her own attorney was then able to use in her settlement negotiations. She called me afterward, crying, telling me that having someone who had genuinely lived through something similar review her documents made her feel less alone in a process that had, until that point, felt entirely isolating. That call stayed with me for days afterward, understanding, more clearly than I had in the earlier months of my own recovery, that whatever devastating shape my own story had taken, it had left me with something genuinely useful to offer other people navigating similar terrain, a strange, unexpected gift buried inside an otherwise painful chapter. Carol Hendricks and I still talk occasionally, roughly once a month, an unlikely friendship formed entirely out of shared devastation that has slowly become something warmer. Two people who understand a very specific kind of betrayal in a way few others in either of our lives fully can. She flew up to Charlotte once, about 2 months ago, and we had dinner together, comparing notes not on our shared pain anymore, but on the specific, hard-won satisfaction of rebuilding a life neither of us had chosen to need rebuilding. Derek Voss's legal troubles have continued expanding since our mediation concluded. The broader civil fraud complaint Robert Castellan's investigation helped initiate now includes, as of last month, a fourth woman from a fourth state, and Vanessa tells me the accumulated pattern across 4 separate cases has made settlement negotiations on his end considerably more difficult, given how thoroughly the documented pattern undermines any individual case's characterization as an isolated, ordinary romantic relationship gone complicated. I do not know, and have made a deliberate choice not to closely track, exactly how those proceedings will ultimately resolve. I have found, these past months, that my own peace does not actually depend on watching Derek Voss's downfall unfold in real time. Diane, for her part, remains in Charlotte, though I understand, secondhand through Kevin's careful, limited updates, that her relationship with Derek did not survive the mediation's revelations intact, a detail I did not ask for directly, and Kevin did not elaborate on further, understanding, I think, that I needed that particular piece of information to remain at a respectful distance from my own daily life, rather than becoming something I dwelled on. Last month, on what would have been our 34th wedding anniversary, I found myself, almost without deciding to, driving past the church where we were married decades ago. I did not go inside. I sat in my car outside for perhaps 10 minutes, allowing myself to feel whatever needed feeling, the genuine grief for 30 years of real, complicated, ultimately betrayed love, before driving home to my own quiet, forest green living room, understanding that grief and healing are not sequential stages you complete and move past, but companions that simply learn slowly to take up somewhat less space over time. If there is one thing I want you to take from this, it is that the specific, accumulated trust of a long marriage can become its own kind of vulnerability. The very intimacy that makes a partnership meaningful also creating exactly the blind spots a determined, patient manipulator can exploit for months or even years before the full shape of what is happening becomes visible. Trust your instincts when something feels almost right but not quite. Ask the uncomfortable follow-up question, even when your partner tells you that asking it is itself a form of betrayal. The people most capable of dismantling a life you built together count on you never fully following that instinct all the way to its actual conclusion. I spent 33 years professionally trained to notice exactly this kind of discrepancy in other people's finances, and I still let 18 months of my own marriage warning signs pass by essentially unexamined, because noticing them would have meant confronting something I was not yet ready to confront. If that could happen to me, with all my professional training, I want you to understand it can happen to absolutely anyone, and that noticing it happening to you is not a failure of intelligence or attentiveness. It is simply the specific, particular blindness that deep trust creates, and recognizing that blindness is the first step toward protecting yourself from it. And here is the second thing, the harder lesson underneath the first one. However this particular betrayal ends for you, whatever specific shape your own version of that birthday party humiliation takes, the people who actually love you, a brother who shows up every single evening without being asked, a friend of 4 decades who makes the hard, unwelcome phone call the morning after, sons who eventually, in their own time, find their way to seeing clearly even when clarity costs them something precious about how they understood their own childhood. Those relationships remain considerably more solid than whatever foundation you believed a marriage alone was providing you. I built an entire adult life, assuming Diane was my primary foundation. I have learned in these 6 difficult months that the foundation was actually considerably wider and considerably more resilient than I understood it to be, built out of every relationship I had quietly, faithfully maintained across 4 decades, waiting, without my fully realizing it, to hold me up exactly when I needed it most. I think, too, about something Carol Hendricks told me during our very first phone call, a piece of wisdom I did not fully appreciate until considerably later in this process. She told me that the specific shame of being deceived this way, of not seeing it sooner, of having trusted someone this completely, is itself part of what these manipulators count on, understanding that victims of this kind of exploitation often stay silent out of embarrassment, allowing the pattern to continue undiscovered and unpunished considerably longer than it otherwise would. Speaking about it, documenting it, refusing to let shame keep you quiet, is not just personal. It is, in its own way, a form of protection for whoever might otherwise become the next person these particular patterns are practiced on. If this story affected you, I would be grateful if you shared your own thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever discovered that a trusted relationship was not what it appeared to be, only after enough time had passed that the full pattern finally became visible? Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. And if you want more stories like this one, please consider subscribing so you do not miss what I have to share next. Thank you for staying with me until the end. Trust your instincts when something feels almost right but not quite. Ask the uncomfortable questions. And remember that the people who show up for you consistently over decades are the real foundation, whether or not you ever needed a crisis to fully see that clearly. A final note before you go. Certain names, locations, and identifying details in this story have been altered to protect the privacy of everyone involved. If you or someone you know is navigating a divorce involving suspected financial misconduct, please consult a qualified family law attorney and, where appropriate, a forensic accountant directly.